In the ancient world, two powerful forces, Athens and Corinth, clashed in an epic struggle that led to the Peloponnesian War. But who was really behind this conflict? Today, we'll delve into the dirty secrets of the geopolitics of the time to find the answer. Subscribe to the channel and don't forget to like. The wind blowing from the Aegean Sea carried the smells of salt, resin, and impending doom as conflicts flared up on the coast of Greece, directly foreshadowing the greatest war of the ancient world. The first spark was the dispute over Kerkyra, now Corfu, a strategically important and wealthy island. Kerkyra was not just a colony of Corinth, it was its pride and joy, but also a long-standing rival whose power sometimes eclipsed that of the metropolis itself, the founding city. Imagine the bustling port of Corinth, with merchants bustling about and shipyards buzzing with activity. Here, amid the creaking of ropes and the shouts of dock workers, discontent had been brewing for a long time. Corfu, with the second largest fleet in Greece after Athens, felt strong enough to challenge its former patron. And so, in 435 BC, conflict broke out over the small colony of Epidamnus on the coast of Illyria. The locals, expelled from their city, turned to Corfu for help, but it refused. Then, in desperation, they asked Corinth for protection. The Corinthians, not missing the opportunity to strengthen their position, took Epidamnus under their wing. This was a direct challenge to Corfu, which immediately sent a fleet to Epidam and laid siege to it. Tensions rose. Corinth began to assemble a huge fleet and army, preparing for a large-scale expedition against its former colony. Corfu, realizing that it could not cope with the power of Corinth on its own, turned to Athens for help. This was a risky move, as Athens and Corinth were long-standing rivals, and Athens' intervention could drag them into the conflict. After lengthy debates, Athens decided to support Corcyra. This decision was dictated not so much by sympathy for the Corcyraeans as by strategic considerations. The strengthening of Corinth, which possessed such a powerful fleet, would be a direct threat to Athens' naval supremacy. In 433 BC, a grand naval battle took place near the Sabothian Islands. The Athenian fleet, although significantly smaller than the Corinthian fleet, was ordered not to engage in direct combat, but only to prevent the Corinthians from landing on Corcyra. However, when the Corinthians began to suffer defeat, the Athenian ships could not resist and intervened, saving their allies from complete destruction. The Corinthians, confronted by the Athenian triremes, were forced to retreat, but this incident became indisputable proof of Athens' hostile intentions. The seas, where trade had once flourished peacefully, were now filled with the spirit of war, and the waters around the Sabothian Islands seemed to have forever remembered the bitterness of defeat and the taste of betrayal. No sooner had the echoes of the naval battle died down than a new source of tension appeared on the horizon, Potidaea. This city, located on the Chalkidiki Peninsula, was a Corinthian colony, but it was part of the Athenian naval alliance and paid tribute to Athens. Athens, concerned about the growing influence of Corinth and the recent incident with Corfu, demanded that Potidaea demolish part of its city walls and expel Corinthian officials. This was unacceptable to the Potidaeans, and they turned to Corinth and Sparta for help. The Corinthians, feeling that their colonies were falling victim to Athenian expansionism one after another, immediately sent a detachment of volunteers and military aid to Potidaea. Athens, in turn, laid siege to the city. This deepened the crisis to a critical level, effectively bringing Corinth and Athens to the brink of open war. By the time these events took place, Athens had achieved unprecedented power. After defeating Persia in the Greco-Persian Wars, it had transformed from the leader of a defensive alliance into a veritable maritime empire. The Athenian naval alliance, created to protect the Greek polis from the Persian threat, gradually became an instrument of Athenian domination. Annual contributions, originally intended for the construction of the fleet, became a tribute, and allies who tried to leave the alliance faced the military might of Athens. Imagine Athens at that time, a magnificent city adorned with new temples such as the Parthenon, its agora bustling with life, and hundreds of triremes in the harbor of Piraeus ready to set sail at any moment. It was the golden age of Athens, but also a time when its ambitions began to threaten the rest of the Greek world. Athens pursued a blatantly expansionist policy, seeking to control trade routes, sources of raw materials, and strategically important territories. This inevitably brought them into conflict with traditional rivals such as Corinth, whose prosperity depended on maritime trade, and Megara, a neighboring polis that was also an important trading center. One of the most striking examples of Athenian policy was the so-called Megarian decree. In 432 BC, Athens passed a decree that effectively imposed a trade embargo on Megara. The Megarians were forbidden from using Athenian markets and ports, which dealt a devastating blow to their economy. This decision was justified by the fact that the Megarians allegedly cultivated sacred land and gave refuge to Athenian fugitives. However, the real reason was Athens' desire to weaken its neighbor and eliminate a competitor. In Athens, at a meeting of the ecclesia, where thousands of citizens voted by a show of hands, the adoption of such a decree may have seemed only a logical step to protect their interests. But for other city-states, especially those dependent on trade, it was a wake-up call. The Megarian psephism became a powerful propaganda tool, actively used by Corinth and Sparta to accuse Athens of aggression and violation of the autonomy of other poli. They pointed out that Athens, once the defender of freedom, was now trampling on it, using its power to dictate terms. This decree was not just economic pressure. It became a symbol of Athenian arrogance and willingness to go to any lengths to further its interests. In fact, beneath these visible tensions lay a deep existential struggle for the very nature of the Greek world. The conflict between Athens and Sparta, and in essence between two dominant hegemonies, was not simply a clash between two powerful poli, but a clash between two fundamentally different ideologies, two models of state structure, and two paths of Hellenic civilization. Athens, with its flourishing democracy, openness to the world, and unrivaled naval power, embodied progress, dynamism, and expansion. Their arche, or empire, was built on the idea of maritime supremacy, control of trade routes, and, importantly, the financial dependence of their allies. The annual phoros, or tribute, collected by Athens did not simply replenish the treasury. It financed grandiose construction projects, maintained the largest fleet, and ensured the prosperity of thousands of Athenian citizens, especially the phetes, the lowest class who formed the basis of the rowers on triremes and, as a result, wielded considerable political influence. It was these phetes, whose prosperity depended directly on the maritime empire, who were among the most ardent supporters of the preservation and expansion of Athenian power. Sparta, on the other hand, was a conservative, oligarchic polis whose strength was concentrated in its land army and strict military discipline. For the Spartans and their allies, united in the Peloponnesian League, the main value was autonomy, the independence of each polis from external dictates. The Athenian arche, with its compulsory membership and imposition of Athenian laws and judicial decisions, was perceived as a direct encroachment on this sacred autonomy. Sparta, although it was the hegemon of its league, never demanded tribute from its allies and did not interfere in their internal affairs as Athens did. Their leadership was based more on mutual defense obligations and respect for traditions. Thus, the Peloponnesian War was not simply a war over territory or trade privileges, but also an ideological conflict that decided which model of government, a democratic empire or a conservative alliance of autonomous polis, would dominate the Greek world. It was precisely this deep contradiction that lay at the heart of the grains of sand that triggered the avalanche. The conflict over Epidamnus, for example, was not simply a dispute over a colony. It exposed the vulnerability of Corinth, Athens' long-standing commercial rival, and demonstrated its inability to defend its interests on its own. Corfu, rich and proud, was a Corinthian colony, but had long sought complete independence. And its appeal to Athens was not just a search for protection, but also an attempt to use Athenian power to break away from the metropolis once and for all. By accepting Corcyra into its alliance, Athens not only gained the second-largest fleet in Greece, which significantly strengthened its naval superiority, but also dealt a direct blow to the economic and strategic interests of Corinth. Corinth, located on an isthmus, controlled key trade routes between the east and west, and its fleet was vital to maintaining that control. The strengthening of Athens in the Ionian Sea, where Corinth dominated, was perceived as a direct threat to its survival. Subsequent events involving Potidaea only confirmed Corinth's worst fears. This city, being both a Corinthian colony and a member of the Athenian naval alliance, was a unique case. Athens' demand to demolish part of the city walls and expel Corinthian officials was seen as an open encroachment on the sovereignty of Potidaea, and, more importantly, as an attempt by Athens to finally sever its ties with Corinth. For Corinth, this was not simply the loss of a colony. It was a matter of honor and a demonstration that Athens was prepared to absorb its rival's allies without hesitation. The dispatch of Corinthian volunteers to Potidaea was not only an act of support, but also a symbolic challenge to Athenian aggression, an attempt to show that Corinth would not abandon its allies in trouble, even if it meant risking direct confrontation with Athens. The siege of Potidaea by Athenian forces thus became not just a military action, but a declaration of intent that made it clear to Corinth that diplomatic channels had been exhausted. Athenian policy, especially under Pericles, was permeated by the idea of asserting their hegemony as a natural and inevitable order of things. Pericles, an outstanding orator and strategist, convinced the Athenians that their maritime empire was not just a source of wealth, but also a guarantee of their freedom and prosperity. He saw Sparta and its allies as an obstacle to Athens' complete domination of Hellas. His strategy was to use the power of the Athenian fleet to control the sea and the city walls to protect the city itself and its population from land invasions. He was convinced that Athens could withstand any siege as long as its fleet dominated the sea, ensuring food supplies and the ability to counterattack. This strategy, known as the Pericles strategy, involved abandoning the defense of the Attic countryside and concentrating all forces within the long walls that connected Athens with its ports, Piraeus and Phaleron. For the Spartans, whose military doctrine was based on direct confrontation on land and the siege of cities, such tactics were unusual and puzzling. But it was precisely this that gave Athens its unique resilience in the face of the superior land forces of the Peloponnesian League. However, Athens' apparent invulnerability concealed deep fears and contradictions. Sparta's reluctance to see Athens become infinitely powerful was based not only on ideological incompatibility or economic competition, but also on a fundamental fear. The fear that Athens, having gained unlimited power, would sooner or later turn it against Sparta itself and its allies. This fear, as Thucydides noted, was the main, though not always openly acknowledged, cause of the war. The Spartans, a people whose lives were subject to the strictest discipline and the preservation of internal order, were particularly sensitive to the threat posed by the unpredictable and dynamic Athenian democracy, whose ambitions seemed limitless. In their view, the Athenian arche was not simply an alliance, but a tyranny enslaving free polis. And this contradicted the very spirit of Hellenic freedom, which Sparta considered its mission to defend. The pressure on Sparta from its allies was enormous and played no small part in fueling the conflict. Corinth, as already mentioned, was the main initiator and most ardent supporter of the war. Its economic prosperity and prestige as a leading trading power were under direct threat. The Corinthians, whose colonies and trade routes stretched across the Mediterranean, saw Athenian expansion as an existential threat. They could not accept that their former colonies, such as Corcyra and Potidaea, were either coming under the complete influence of Athens or becoming arenas for Athenian intervention. For Corinth, whose identity was inextricably linked to the sea, Athenian expansion was not just a threat, but a challenge to its very existence. They saw Athens like an insatiable Moloch devouring one polis after another, and understood that inaction would lead to their own demise. Not only Corinth, but other allies of Sparta, such as Megara, Argos, Aegina, and Boeotia, also had compelling reasons to pressure Sparta. Megara, whose economy had been undermined by the Athenian embargo, craved revenge and liberation from Athens' suffocating grip. For them, war was a matter of survival. Aegina, Athens' long-standing maritime rival, had been humiliated and stripped of its fleet after its defeat in the conflict of the 450s BC, becoming a forced member of the Athenian League. Its inhabitants, deprived of their freedom and self-government, were willing to do anything to regain their independence. Boeotia, with its powerful city of Thebes at its head, saw Athenian expansion as a threat to its own hegemony in central Greece, and sought to undermine Athenian influence, especially in the border regions. These allies, each with their own grievances and fears, flocked to Sparta, demanding decisive action. Their voices, full of anger and despair, were heard at the meetings of the Peloponnesian League, creating unbearable pressure on the Spartan ephors and kings. Ultimately, although Corinth actively pushed for war, the real reason lay in Sparta's fear of Athens' growing power. Both city-states played their part in unleashing the conflict, but its root cause lay in the inevitability of a clash between empires. This story serves as a reminder of the eternal lessons of geopolitics and human nature.